Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things affect you and me. Now, in this week's episode, I want to return to the prophecy of Revelation 17 and 18, the prophecy of the great harlot of Mystery Babylon. On last episode, we took some time to discuss some of the problems with the interpretation that this prophecy is speaking of the United States. This is an increasingly popular view within some prophecy circles. Many people believe that Revelation is speaking about the United States or New York City specifically. Now, in this week's episode, we're going to discuss another interpretation, which some people hold, some very, very strong, hold this position, and this is the idea that the city of Jerusalem is the fulfillment of the prophecy, that Jerusalem is the great harlot, that apostate Judaism, the apostate, rebellious, Christ-rejecting side of Judaism, if you will, that is the fulfillment of the great harlot. Now, before we jump in, let me just remind you, if you have not picked up a copy of my book, Mystery Babylon, please do so. You can go to my website at joelstrumpet.com. You can get an autographed copy that way. Prices are very reasonable. But beyond that, in order to just give people the resources necessary to understand these things, to understand what's unfolding in the earth, I've also put together a bundle in which not only do you get my book, a signed copy, you also get The Babylon Connection, which is by the Reverend Ralph Woodrow. This is a book that I'm convinced that every student of prophecy needs to read. I mean, this is one of the, not a lot of people have read this, but this is so critical, and it deals with issues of Nimrod and Alexander Hislop, and a book called The Two Babylons. It's an essential read. So I throw this in along with the debate, do the scriptures teach a Roman or a Muslim antichrist? It's nearly a 3-hour debate. This was between myself and Dr. Tommy Ice of the Pre-Trib Research Center. This was in August of 2016. So I throw those all in for a great price. The Babylon bundle, again, go to joelstrumpet.com and grab the bundle. Okay, so with regard to this issue of Jerusalem as Babylon, before we jump in, it's important that we point out that there are two distinct interpretations. The first one is called the preterist interpretation. The preterist interpretation, or the historical interpretation, is the idea that the historical city of Jerusalem in the first century, and not just the city, but its accompanying leadership, the religious aristocracy, the priests and the Pharisees and the leaders of the people, those who largely rejected Jesus, and not just Jesus, but who were in many ways through their religious system really living in a rebellious form, not truly obeying God's decrees, covenants, and His commandments, etc. Okay, so the idea that the Judaism and the Jerusalem of the first century, ultimately culminating with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, that was what the prophecy was talking about. Thus, it is already all historically fulfilled. Okay, so the preterist interpretation, again, the historical interpretation, most often holds that much of Revelation is already past. It is a historical prophecy. It's not something that we're looking forward to in the future. We're not looking for a coming Antichrist, a coming fall of Babylon, a coming Great Tribulation, all of these things. Okay, so the preterist interpretation, those that hold that Jerusalem of 70 AD was Mystery Babylon, some different names, N.T. Wright, leading New Testament scholar. Don Preston is a leading voice within the hyper-preterist movement. He's written quite a bit on this position. Joel McDurmon, a leading dominionist Christian voice. He's the president of American Vision. He's written on this a bit, and there are quite a few others Not as many, quite as vocal as some of these men, but there are many, many. And again, they would be considered conservative evangelicals, but most often in slightly more scholarly circles, this sort of position is not very popular, really on the popular level, the grassroots level. So those are just a few names. Now, I want to go ahead and just read a few quotes just so you can get a feel for what these individuals teach and hold. So here's a statement from N.T. Wright. He says, Jerusalem and its hierarchy have taken on the role of Babylon. Now he's speaking of the first century. He says they've taken on the role of Babylon, Edom, and Antiochus Epiphanes. So essentially, he names some of the most prominent adversarial pagan entities in the Old Testament that the people of God would have understood Babylon. This was the city that carried, through Nebuchadnezzar, carried away the southern kingdom of Judah, destroyed Jerusalem. Edom, of course, one of the premier enemies of God throughout scriptures, and they become sort of the embodiment of the eschatological enemies of God. Edom, and then of course Antiochus Epiphanes, arguably the greatest type of the Antichrist in all of scripture, the Greek king from the Seleucid dynasty that killed, according to Josephus and the book of Maccabees, killed approximately 40,000 Jerusalemites and then carried away roughly another 40,000, made Judaism illegal. Of course, it tells the whole story in some of the intertestamental literature, the books of Maccabees, but just a brutal, brutal guy. He's highlighted in, of course, the book of Daniel. And so according to N.T. Wright, Jerusalem has actually taken on the role. There's been this role reversal to where the very enemies of God were actually foreshadows, not of outside pagan invaders, rather they were pictures of Jerusalem itself. He says God has really done this profound role reversal and just sort of flipped everything on its head. So he says, again, Jerusalem, they are the city whose fall spells the vindication of the true people of Israel's God. Again, classic replacement theology language that you have false Israel, and then those that are believers are the true or the new Israel. And of course, this is true. Those who are of faith, they are true Israel. But the idea that old Israel has permanently forever been rejected, and the Lord has given the kingdom to another people, this sort of thing, permanently, that is classic replacement theology. So he goes on to say, he says, the prophecies of rescue from the tyrant, okay, now please take note of this, the prophecies of rescue from the tyrant have come true in and for Jesus and in his people. When this city, Jerusalem, falls, they must leave quickly. This is their moment of salvation and vindication. So you can see, once again, this complete dramatic role reversal. I mean, literally 180 degrees exact opposite. Instead of delivering Jerusalem from foreign oppressors, Jerusalem itself is the oppressor, according to N.T. Wright. This is a pretty dramatic sort of inversion of the entire biblical testimony, but we'll dig into that a bit more. Now, here's a statement from Joel McDurmon, again, president of American Vision. This is in his book, Jesus vs. Jerusalem. And note the very strong language here, because this is inevitably, I call this the deadly logic of supersessionism, the deadly logic of replacement theology. When you follow replacement theology's logic through to its natural conclusion, this is the type of thought process that you inevitably end up at. So Mr. McDurmon says this. He says, the old Jewish people were not merely exiled from their kingdom someday to return. No, this time the kingdom was taken from them and given to the true nation, bearing the fruits thereof. Again, he's speaking of 70 A.D., the fall of Jerusalem. He says, listen, they weren't just temporarily exiled. This time it was permanent. Back with the exile under Nebuchadnezzar, it was temporary because they came back. He's saying under the Romans, it was permanent. The Lord permanently took the kingdom away from them. Now, for clarity, we do agree that the Lord took the kingdom away from that particular generation, and he gave it to the believers, true Israel, those who were of Israel, those who were believers, as well as the Gentiles who came in. All those who are of faith, of their father Abraham, are essentially children of Abraham. But the idea that the Lord has permanently taken away his calling, his election, his plans for future grace and the fullness of corporate Israel in the future, that is where we deviate dramatically from Mr. McDermott. So he says, this time the kingdom was taken from them, given to the true nation, bearing the fruits thereof. Christ created a new bride. This is the language that we need to pay attention to. Why would Christ desire to return to the whore he has cast aside and divorced when he has a pristine bride descending from heaven, clothed in righteousness? That's a typo. And uncorrupted by idolatry. He doesn't. He left that whore riding her patron, the beast of Rome, and the great mother of harlots suffered the judgment of her whoredom. She was divorced and disinherited. This is the reason why I call supersessionism, or replacement theology, same thing. This is why I call it divorce theology, because it holds that God divorced Israel, that in light of their unfaithfulness, in light of their backslidden, ongoing, rebellious nature, God permanently divorced them, and he got himself a new bride. It is divorce theology, okay? We're going to touch on this some more. So the first problem, and this is critical, the first glaring, looming problem with the preterist interpretation that Jerusalem is Mystery Babylon is the problem of witness. What do I mean by that? Well, how do you feel when you listen to Mr. McDermott say, God divorced that old whore, Jerusalem, and he got himself a new bride, that he got himself a new pristine bride? This is the language, this kind of language. It articulates, it communicates a God which is really no different than the stereotypical man who goes through the stereotypical midlife crisis, divorces his old wife, slanders her name all around town, on social media and this sort of thing, and then he gets himself a new, younger model, a new bride. And this is sort of the stereotypical man that everyone loves to hate, and yet this is the picture. This is the character, the nature of God that we are communicating to the world. You see, our job as witnesses of Yahweh, as witnesses of Jesus, as ambassadors of the Father, is to represent him to the world, is to communicate and articulate his nature, his character to the world. How are we communicating to the world when we embrace a theology that says because of their unfaithfulness, God decided that he would no longer be faithful? Because the scriptures are very, very clear, consistently throughout the prophets, consistently throughout the New Testament, that despite Israel's unfaithfulness, despite her persistent unfaithfulness, and I would also highlight our persistent unfaithfulness, because he goes on, he goes, Christ created a new bride, a pristine bride. She bears the true fruits thereof. Listen, I've been part of many different churches in the 25 plus years since I've been a believer. And I've seen some great, wonderful things. I've seen some heroic works, but I've seen some colossal failures. I've seen a lot of unfaithfulness. I've seen a lot of lack of pristine, pure bride-like activity, right? The church is just as backslidden and wayward as Israel, but it is God. It's not contingent on our great faithfulness. It's contingent on his faithfulness. And this is really the issue of what it comes down to. Is God faithful or is he not? Because throughout the prophets, throughout the New Testament, the Lord portrays himself as one who, despite Israel's unfaithfulness, he will in the end draw them to himself, restore them to himself, impart his very spirit into them, and through the new covenant, give them his heart, give them a new spirit, and he will bring about everything that he promised that he would do to them and through them and in them by his Spirit, as promised, as declared, as reiterated throughout the covenants, throughout the scriptures. In the end, God will be seen, he will be vindicated as faithful throughout the earth. Despite Israel's unfaithfulness, despite our unfaithfulness, he will accomplish his works because he is faithful. And that's really what this boils down to. Are we communicating a faithful God, or are we communicating a God who, again, divorces his old wife and gets himself a new bride? This is a huge, huge issue, and we're going to come back to this. Now, the second problem with this preterist Jerusalem interpretation is the problem of contradiction. And really, this problem, in many ways, this sort of piggybacks off of the first problem, and it relates to the issue of witness. But really, even more so, it represents a fundamental. The preterist interpretation represents a fundamental perversion of the biblical testimony concerning God's plan, concerning God's character. And so here's a statement from N.T. Wright. He says this: instead of seeing Jerusalem as the victim of pagan aggression or corruption, Jerusalem herself is Babylon. So again, I'm talking about this complete role reversal. Now, throughout the prophets, I mean, we could take weeks just to discuss the many, many passages throughout the scriptures. At the day of the Lord, when Jesus returns, Israel, Jerusalem, the city itself, the land is portrayed as being surrounded by foreign, pagan, Gentile nations and armies. And then the Lord returns to deliver Israel in her darkest hour from the ultimate annihilation, from destruction by the surrounding nations. The Lord judges the nations. Now, He uses the nations to chastise His people. I want to be very clear. He uses them to purify, again, you could use the word judge, but really to chastise, as a father chastises his children, for the purpose and the goal of restoration. He uses the nations to chastise His people because God is God even over the Antichrist. God Himself is sovereign. We need to acknowledge this. But in the end, He returns and He judges the nations. He breaks the very rod that He used over His knee. And then He saves and He delivers Israel and He restores her and He sets up His everlasting kingdom from Jerusalem. And so this whole idea that all of these prophecies, which very specifically say the nations, the peoples would come against Jerusalem, that those were actually foreshadows of the destruction of Jerusalem itself. It's not just an inversion. It's not just a role reversal. It is a complete fundamental perversion of the biblical testimony, of the biblical story of redemption. Okay, we need to acknowledge the difference between sort of Jesus playing a little, like in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where He goes, listen, you're thinking about it all wrong. At times the Lord does this. He challenges wrong assumptions and this sort of thing, but He doesn't completely override the entire overwhelming testimony of the Scriptures. And that's exactly the position that N.T. Wright takes. By making Jerusalem the very embodiment of evil, rather than as the wayward child that will be chastened and then restored, he is completely perverting, distorting, twisting the biblical testimony. So let's just elaborate on this a little bit more. The Lord has made some very clear covenants, some promises to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And these promises concern the land, the very specific land of Israel. This becomes the very platform whereby God will redeem all of creation. The land of Israel, the city of Jerusalem, Mount Zion. This becomes the location, the piece of property whereby the Lord is going to redeem all of the earth. He's going to redeem people from every tongue, tribe, people, and nation. He has a universal plan of restoration, but He has a very specific base of operation whereby He has promised that He would accomplish these things. And He makes these points crystal clear throughout the prophets, throughout the covenants. So please look up Genesis 17, verse 7. Genesis 17, verse 13, verse 19, many, many other passages. The idea that the Lord is rejecting His people as opposed to chastising for the purpose of restoring His people is a fundamental perversion of the biblical testimony. Let's just read one passage as an example. Now, the New Covenant, most Christians are familiar with the New Covenant, and we're familiar with it largely because of the Gospels. But what most Christians are not aware of is that you have a few places in the Old Testament prophets, most notably in the three major prophets, in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, and in Ezekiel, where all three of them mention the New Covenant. So please look up Isaiah 59. At the end of Isaiah 59, verse 20 and 21, and then really all the way into Isaiah 60, the Lord is talking about the New Covenant. The New Covenant. He was prophesying concerning the New Covenant. Likewise, in Jeremiah 30, all the way through 33, really, but Jeremiah 31, in those chapters, He's discussing the New Covenant, the fulfillment of His promises, the culmination of the Abrahamic, the Davidic, and then the New Covenant. That day is yet future. And then, of course, in Ezekiel 36, likewise, Ezekiel the prophet spoke of the New Covenant. So I want to just read this. And please take note of the fact that the fulfillment of the New Covenant will happen in the context of the land of Israel. And the context is the people of Israel. Now, again, the Gentiles, we get pulled into this if we are of faith, because by faith we are children of Abraham. But the Lord is not, when he speaks of Israel, when he speaks of the house of Israel and the house of Judah, he's not spiritually speaking of Gentiles. Okay, so there's an issue here, by the way, and I should highlight this, which is an issue of interpretation and of language. Now, in everyday common language, we interpret people's comments through the lens of what we call rational literalism, which is to say that as I'm talking to you right now, by and large, if you're familiar with my culture, if you speak my language, if you're from the United States, and especially if you grew up where I grew up, then you get my humor and the nuances, you get my figures of speech, you get my expressions. You can tell when I'm joking. You can tell when I'm serious. If I start speaking in poetry, you know the difference between poetry and storytelling and this sort of thing, right? But I'm going to use all kinds of figures of speech, different expressions. But by and large, essentially what I'm saying, I'm speaking in a very literal sense, and you can understand that. Now, if you were to, let's say I went into my kitchen and there's a note on the table, and it has a list of grocery items that my wife has written out. Now, if I look at this grocery list, a grocery list is a particular type of, you could say, literature. It's a list. Now, if I interpret that list as a grocery list, I have interpreted it rightly. It's literally a list. Now, if I look at that and I'm trying to understand the deeper meaning, what does she mean by Brussels sprouts? What does she mean by kale? What is the deeper spiritual meaning here? What is kale symbolic of? The truth is, if I were to try to understand a grocery list that way, chances are that someone who reads things that way is probably suffering from some type of mental illness. Chances are they're schizophrenic. So, you hear stories where some TV show host, David Letterman, he's talking, and some woman out there believes that he's speaking in secret code to her. Okay? She was schizophrenic. You have the story of Helter Skelter, right? And Charles Manson believed that the Beatles were speaking in secret code to him, and they were telling him he had to go kill all these people. He was schizophrenic, okay? So we understand that in normal life. When you interpret a song or a grocery list or a TV show in the wrong way, you spiritualize it, you symbolize it, it's allegorical, it has deeper meaning, usually you're schizophrenic. When biblical interpreters read clear language. Now, again, I want to be clear, biblical prophecy, apocalyptic language, oftentimes it has poetry and these sort of things, but you understand, it's poetry, but it's speaking of very literal realities. When you interpret these things through such a harsh allegorical lens, how is that any different than a schizophrenic who interprets a grocery list as having some deeper spiritual meaning? Yet this is the method of interpretation, the hyper-allegorized method of interpretation that is often employed by some of these brilliant New Testament scholars that lead them to embrace their particular interpretation. I interpret the Bible through the lens of rational literalism. It's not a hyper-literal, it's not a wooden literalism, it's a rational literalism. This is the way that all language works. This is common sense. And so the effort of some New Testament scholars to go back and interpret these Old Testament prophecies as when it talks about Israel, well, it's really speaking about the church. No, that's essentially a schizophrenic method of interpreting the Scriptures. It's irresponsible, and it's not the way the Scriptures were intended to be read. So what does Ezekiel say here? He's talking about the new covenant. Ezekiel 36, 22 through verse 28. Therefore say to the house of Israel, thus saith the Lord God, I will take you from the nations. What's the nations? That's the Gentiles. So they are dispersed. They are exiled among the nations. I will gather you from all the lands and bring you back to your own land. What is that talking about? It's simple, straightforward language. God says to Israel, to the people of Israel, I'm going to take you from exile among the Gentiles. I'm going to bring you back to your own land. It means what it says. Then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all the filthiness of your idols. Moreover, I will give you a new heart and a new spirit. This, my friends, is the new covenant. God says, I'm going to put a new spirit, a new heart in you. He's speaking to the house of Israel. This is not symbolic language for the church. I will cleanse you from all your filthiness. I will put a new spirit within you. I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh. I will give you a heart of flesh. In other words, a soft heart. I will put my spirit within you. I will cause you to walk in my statutes. You will be careful to observe my ordinances. You will live in the land that I gave to your forefathers, so that you will be my people. I will be your God. This is an extension of the very Abrahamic covenant. God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants that I'm going to give you this piece of land. Why? Again, because the land is the platform. It's the foundation of his larger global plan of redemption. And then he promised, after his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then he promised one of the descendants of Judah, one of the children of Israel. He promised King David, and from your descendants, I'm going to raise up a king, and his kingdom will last forever. And your throne and your kingdom, David, will last forever. Now, David's throne and David's kingdom were never in heaven. Jesus today is sitting at the right hand of the Father, but he has yet to return in blazing fire and glory with all of his angels with him and sit on his throne of glory. Matthew 19 and chapter 25. That day has yet to come. He will come back. He will restore the throne of David, as he said he would. Luke 1, when Gabriel the angel comes to Mary and he says, "This baby in your womb, he is going to sit on the throne of David." This permeates not just the Old Testament, but the New Testament. And so here in Ezekiel, talking about the new covenant, God says, I'm going to put my spirit in you, then you'll be obedient. Friends, that day has not come yet. The Lord has promised future grace, future mercy for the whole house of Israel. He will restore them in their land, and he will put his king over them. He will fulfill his promises. Why? Because he is faithful. And so when you have this interpretation, when you have this perspective that God has just reversed roles and that Jerusalem is forever divorced, that Jerusalem is actually Babylon, that Jerusalem is actually Antiochus Epiphanes, you have not just simply cast God as unfaithful, you have completely perverted the biblical testimony. All of the things that God said he is going to do in the way of restoration, you've claimed have been fulfilled in Israel's destruction. This is the equivalent of saying that all of God's promises of hope were fulfilled in the Holocaust. It is ultimately it is a sick, perverted position. And this is an accurate description because 70 AD, with the destruction of Jerusalem, oftentimes this is referred to as the first Holocaust, as roughly 1.5 million Jews were killed during that time. Okay, but to say that that was the fulfillment of biblical hope and expectation, and that which all the prophets were speaking of, it's not just perverted, it's evil. It's evil. And people of God who understand the heart of God, who understand the testimony of the biblical prophets. Listen, N.T. Wright is a brilliant man. He's beyond brilliant. And he is a brother, but on this position, he could not be more wrong. He has perverted the testimony of the biblical prophets, and he has perverted the testimony of the angel Gabriel, John the Baptist, Jesus, and the apostles. And careful students of the scriptures should reject this position. So, preterists, unfortunately, such as Mr. McDermott, say that Christ created a new bride, that Israel's exiles were permanent, that he has cast them off, that they are forever rejected, this sort of thing. These kind of things, by the way, have led to tremendous historical mistreatment of the Jewish people throughout Europe, as Christians were saying, well, if God has cast them off, if God is permanently punishing them, then how should we treat them as servants of God? Should we not participate with God and his punishment of the Jews? And you see these type of statements expressed down through church history, and then you see actions associated with them. So it's dangerous. That's why I call it the deadly logic of supersessionism. It's dangerous. But what does Paul say? Mr. McDermott says that Christ created a new bride. What does Paul say in Romans 11, verse 1, verse 2, and verse 11? He says, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. Paul the Apostle was like, are you crazy? Are you meshuggah? Are you nuts? This, of course, the God of Israel, who chooses more than any other name throughout the scriptures to call himself the God of Israel. The idea that he has rejected Israel, may it never be. Far be it from God that this would be something that he would do. This is a very betrayal of the very character of God. Verse 2, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. They did not stumble so as to fall. In other words, they didn't stumble. They didn't go down for the count. They stumbled, but not so as to go down for the count permanently. Did they? Again, may it never be. So Paul the Apostle, he takes this type of replacement theology on that was beginning to spread in Rome at the time. And he goes, far be it, you guys. The scriptures are clear that this is the very antithesis of the character of God and his testimony. May it never be. Far be it from God. God forbid that he would ever reject his people. So again, it's simply not tenable. It's simply not possible in light of the consistent testimony of the scriptures. Now, I will highlight this, and this has some overlap, by the way, with the futurist interpretation, but we're going to deal with that next week. Those who point to Jerusalem as Mystery Babylon, they are quick to point out that in Romans 11, verse 8, that Jerusalem is referred to as Sodom and Egypt. The very embodiment, if you will, of apostasy, as the city that judgment is falling upon. And in many ways, that's true. But again, there's a difference between an entity that God is destroying forever, that he is rejecting forever, and a city that he is chastising for the purpose of ultimate restoration. This testimony, in terms of the way the Lord works, it's throughout the scriptures. And he says the same thing with us. You know, the writer of Hebrews goes, listen, don't be surprised when trials and tribulations come into your life. God's treating you like a child. God's treating you like sons. This is how a father deals with his sons. He chastises them. He doesn't want to do it, and it's not comfortable. It's not enjoyable at the time, but it is for your good. It's for your good. And so, you know, preterists that are quick to point out verse 8, they always seem to ignore verse 2, in which time Jerusalem is called holy. So yes, they are referred to in critical language, Sodom and Egypt, but they are at the same time referred to as holy. And this is exactly what Paul does in Romans 11. He goes, listen, for the sake of the gospel, presently, they're your enemies, yes, but they are beloved. They are beloved because of God's calling, his election, his future restoration of Israel. So they are his beloved enemies. And here they are holy Sodom and holy Egypt, if you will. At the time they were in apostasy, but in terms of what God is ultimately going to do with Israel when he returns. Now listen, no one is coming into the kingdom apart from through Jesus, apart from through the Messiah, apart from faith in the Messiah, and repentance and a rejection of reliance upon our own good deeds and our own righteousness. It's only through Jesus. No one comes to the Father other than through Jesus. That is clear. But the scriptures are clear that when Jesus returns, all those who are alive at the time, all of Israel, will look upon the one they have pierced. All of the tribes of the land will mourn and weep, and the spirit of grace and repentance and supplication will be poured out upon them. And all Israel will be saved, and a nation will be born in a day, and life from the dead will explode across the earth like a life-giving nuclear warhead, if you will. And the mushroom cloud of redemption will sweep over the earth, as I said, as the knowledge of God will cover the earth, as the waters presently cover the seas. So whatever negative view of backslidden, rebellious Israel we have, we must have a perspective that speaks of her future restoration. Problem number 3 is the problem of history, and this is significant. Jerusalem simply does not meet its end as described within the prophecy. The prophecy very clearly describes a city which is destroyed suddenly. In 1 hour, it says in Revelation 18, verse 10, and then it will be destroyed forever. It talks about this in several verses at the end of Revelation 18. It describes a city where no longer will you hear the sound of commerce, of bride and bridegroom, of music, this sort of thing. It will be destroyed forever. So a city that is destroyed suddenly in 1 hour and is destroyed forever. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem of history is that Jerusalem in 70 AD was not destroyed in 1 hour. Israel was not destroyed in 1 hour. Rather, you had the fall of the temple. You had, again, a tremendous catastrophe that happened in 70 AD, but it was really over. Well, first of all, the actual fall of Jerusalem unfolded over a period of about 5 years as Domitian and then his son Titus were moving down from Caesarea, eventually surrounding the city, eventually laying the city, besieging the city. But then it was over another period of about 50 plus years leading up to the Bar Kokhba rebellion that Israel was eventually completely, really destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed, turned into, renamed entirely as Jupiter Capitolina, and all of the Jews were exiled out of the city. It was not destroyed in 1 hour. Quite to the contrary, it unfolded over a long period of time. Secondly, what's the other one? It says that Babylon would be destroyed forever, essentially a smoking heap bearing witness to God's judgment on Babylon. It will be cast into the sea. A millstone is cast into the sea. So will Babylon be destroyed, never to be found again, we're told in Revelation. Well, Jerusalem was restored in our time. 1948, the Jews reestablished Israel as a nation, and then in 67, we had the reestablishment of Jerusalem as the capital. Well, it was taken by Israel. That's not destroyed forever. Jerusalem has been restored. Today it is a bustling metropolis. I'll be there in just a couple months. I've been there multiple times. It is a bustling city. Okay, that would be a clear contradiction. The prophecy says destroyed in 1 hour. That didn't happen in history, never to be restored. Jerusalem has been restored. Jerusalem is not Mystery Babylon. Historical Jerusalem cannot be Mystery Babylon. What's another problem? Problem number 4 is the second problem of history. So really, there's multiple historical problems with the preterist interpretation. So another argument made by preterists is that the command to flee Babylon, come out of her, my people, Revelation 18, verse 4, that this command, they are saying, is essentially the same command that Jesus gave in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. This is Jesus' sermon on the end times. It's found in all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels. And Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, and then in Luke 21, he says, when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, flee. All those who are in Judea, that's the southern kingdom, the whole southern part of Israel, flee to the mountains. Okay, so they're saying that what Jesus said and then what's said here in Revelation is one and the same. Again, the historical problem with that is that the church historian Eusebius records that that's not how it went down. That in fact, the Messianic believers, the Christian Jews, if you will, the Messianic believers, they actually fled not in 70 AD, but in 66 AD, 4 years before Jerusalem was indeed surrounded by armies. 4 years before the abomination of desolation was set up. So what they claim is that the believers were looking at the words of Jesus, looking at the words of Revelation, and that they understood what was unfolding as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and they fled to the city of Pella. Eusebius tells us that it was not because of what was happening with the Roman armies, rather it was a prophecy. A prophet rose up and had a word from God, and the Christians listened to that, the Messianic Jews listened to that, and they fled Jerusalem and went to Pella. That it was not because they were paying attention to these prophecies. They were not saying what we see in the earth right now, this is that which Jesus said. No, it was because of the word of a prophet. And so again, history simply does not align with the story that the preterists are laying out. The fifth problem is the third problem of history. So throughout the prophecy, the harlot Babylon is portrayed as a city that falls from the height of its economic power, of global economic and religious influence. The problem is that the city of Jerusalem, yes, it had a lot of influence. You know, you had Jews all over the diaspora, all over the ancient world, all over the Roman Empire. But the problem is Jerusalem was occupied by the Roman armies, and it was literally in the first century, in 70 AD when Jerusalem fell, it was at a low period of influence. It was at a low period roughly over about 2 centuries, about 200 years. It was at its lowest point of influence. It was not at the pinnacle of global influence. Jerusalem was not the great city of opulent economic influence holding sway over the kings of the earth. Yet that is clearly what is described in the prophecy. That does not describe Jerusalem. That is really the two primary things that are described in the prophecy is a city of tremendous economic influence, a city of tremendous religious influence, and really Jerusalem of the time does not meet those descriptions. The city of Rome meets those descriptions in the first century. That was the city that held economic and religious influence over the kings of the earth. And specifically, I believe that Rome was the Babylon of the first century. Okay, Rome was the Babylon of the first century, and this leads to the sixth problem, which is the problem of historical context, which is to say that the first century believers, the Jews and the Christians, okay, so the unbelieving Jews and the Messianic Jews and the Gentiles, they believed that Rome was the new Babylon. 1 Peter 5, verse 13, Peter the apostle, who was in the city of Rome at the time, and virtually every early church writer will affirm, any early church father or writer that speaks of Peter says he was in Rome. We have zero evidence that he was anywhere else than Rome. Writing from Rome, used code language and called Rome Babylon. So if the early believers believed that Rome was the new Babylon, then why in the world would we be expected to believe that the believers would have understood that Jerusalem was the new Babylon? It just simply is not true according to the evidence that we have of history. The very scriptures themselves call Rome Babylon. Now you go, wait a minute, but Joel, you don't believe that Rome is Babylon, because I believe that that Babylon is a concept, that it migrates, that the city of Babylon is the prototype. And in the first century, Rome was the new Babylon. Rome was the new great city of idolatry. It was the new great city of economic and religious idolatrous influence over the earth. But today, Rome is no longer the great city that holds sway over the kings of the earth. Babylon migrates with each new beast empire, with each new head of the beast. So from Babylon to Medo-Persia, to Greece, to Rome, the capital of Satan's stronghold in the earth has migrated. And today there is a new beast empire. The Roman Empire has fallen. It is no longer the reigning beast empire. There is a new satanic empire that holds sway over that whole part of the earth and much of the earth, and it has a different capital. We're going to talk about that at another time. But the bottom line is the early believers, and there's extra biblical literature as well, and some of the Syllabine oracles, and I believe Second Esdras, and maybe even Jubilees, I could have that wrong, refer to Rome, and it uses the code word of Babylon. So the believers of the first century, very apocalyptically minded, they understood Rome to be the new Babylon. So it was not Jerusalem. It was not Jerusalem. So there's a problem of historical context and really just ignoring the historical context. Number 7 is, I want to go back to the first issue, which is the problem of God's heart, the problem of testimony. And this is the problem of witness to the earth. This is a huge one, and we're going to wrap it up here. When the harlot Babylon is destroyed, when she is judged, heaven rejoices. There's this tremendous jubilation that erupts out of heaven. In Revelation 19, 1 through 6, we find a multitude expressing hallelujah, shouts of joy and jubilation because Babylon has been destroyed. They are rejoicing in heaven. Again, in Revelation 19, because the prophecy is not just 17 and 18, it actually extends quite a bit into Revelation 19. But look, here's the thing. When we look at the scriptures, how do the people of God respond in historical moments and times when Jerusalem was destroyed? How did Jeremiah the prophet, the weeping prophet who had God's very heart, in the midst of God judging and chastising his people and the historical fall of Jerusalem, how did Jeremiah the prophet respond? In Lamentations 2, verse 11, we see that Jeremiah wept, bitterly mourned over the fall of Jerusalem. And he was not weeping in the flesh. He was weeping because of the heart of God over this matter. How did Jesus respond? At the mere prospect of Jerusalem's fall, he wept bitterly over the city and he lamented. Now, how can it be that we're setting forth a theology that says that heaven rejoices over that which Jesus wept over? It's a fundamental contradiction and a misunderstanding of God's very heart. God is a God of restoration. God is a God of redemption. God is not a God who celebrates when the city that he has promised to put his name on, that would be the very capital of his Messiah, is allegedly the city of destruction. That simply doesn't work. That simply doesn't make sense. So there's various other issues here that we could touch on. Again, that's a big one, the very fact that God repeatedly throughout the scriptures states that this is the city, that Jerusalem will be forever inhabited, that it will always be inhabited, that the very throne of David would be restored on Mount Zion, and then these statements within Revelation that says that Babylon would be destroyed forever. That simply doesn't make any sense. So again, just to wrap this up, the preterist interpretation, again, I know a lot of folks that study biblical prophecy, you go, well, we don't believe this anyway, but this is a widely held position in various scholarly circles by those that are our brothers and sisters, but it is a position that needs to be rejected by the careful student of the Scriptures, those who care about our witness, those who care about historical accuracy, and most importantly, those who care about being carriers of the very heart of God, that our theology is a reflection of the passions and the things that make God's heart burn. Friends, this is an issue that touches the very apple of his eye. It touches some of the issues that are so central to his heart. And it's the issue of his faithfulness. And it's the issue of his faithfulness to his chosen people and his faithfulness to his promises. So let's get this issue right. Next week, we're going to come back and we're going to discuss the futurist interpretation of Jerusalem and explain why the futurist interpretation of Jerusalem as Mystery Babylon simply doesn't work. But for now, I just want to thank you so much for being with us. As always, I look forward to seeing you next week. I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.